In Peru, there's a book that speaks of indigenous legends. People rose up against feudal lords, made offerings to the Incan gods, professed a coming Indian Renaissance, and spoke of a sun covered in blood. Called the Gospel of Indigenismo by some, it holds stories and prophecies that told of Peru becoming an indigenous country again. This book is titled Tempestad en los Andes, and it's no ancient book. It was published just a century ago in 1927. Yet this indigenous gospel has defined Peruvian identity for almost a century. The author of this book is Luis E. Valcarcel. Born on February 8, 1891 in Ilo District, Moquegua, Valcarcel's family would move to the city of Cusco in 1892, where he would then attend La Universidad Nacional de San Antonio Abad and study the Incas and agrarian policy in Peru. His education and activist work would connect him early on to the Asociación Pro Indígena, a humanitarian organization in Lima dedicated to protecting indigenous legal rights. He would then found with other Cusqueño intellectuals El Grupo Resurgimiento, which politically organized in the Cusqueño countryside under the ideas of the time: indigenismo, incaísmo, and socialismo. His scholarly and organizing work had gotten him included in La Escuela Cusqueña, an informal title for the indigenista scholars that permeated Cusco, like José Uriel García, Luis Felipe Aguilar Páez, and Roberto Latorre Medina. In unlucky twist of fate, however, Valcarcel would be arrested for a few months in 1927 for a prophetic speech he would give in Arequipa, after which he would begin to recede more and more towards scholarly work. And in 1930, the socialist intellectual and close friend of Valcarcel, José Carlos Mariátegui, would die, leaving Valcarcel marginalized by the ensuing political infighting and rigid orthodoxy in Peru's social movements. He would then go on to write 13 more books, hold high national academic positions, and become the father of Peruvian anthropology. He then passed away in 1980 at the old age of 96. In his long life, Valcarcel's guiding ideology would forever be indigenismo, of which he was on the most radical end. Indigenismo was the Latin American movement that sought to reclaim indigenous culture to integrate indigenous peoples and create authentic forms of nationhood. In the early 20th century, the Peruvian elite either heavily romanticized colonial Spanish culture or fetishized high French and corporate American cultures. The indigenistas criticized the Latin American elite's fixation on copying European culture because it stagnated art, philosophy, social inclusion, and even economic development. In essence, this neo-colonial elite betrayed the ideas of Latin American independence to politically and culturally separate from the Spanish Empire. In the face of this, the Peruvian indigenistas insisted on breaking with this post-colonial colonial culture by primarily looking back to the Inca civilization and only occasionally to the living principles in the Quechua communities, known as Ayllus, in the mountain countryside. The book is divided into 11 main sections, each composed of a different genre, from essay to myth to narrative, aphorism to speech, and more. Rather than being one genre, Tempestad en los Andes is a radical injection into Andean literature. And true to his multi-layered writing, Valcarcel was influenced as much by European philosophers and historians as the Latin American indigenistas and his own anthropological research on the Incas. Some of these Europeans were Hippolyte Taine, Oswald Spengler, Ludwig Lampowitz, and Vladimir Lenin. And from Latin America, his influences were the Peruvian writers José Carlos Mariátegui and Federico Mohr. One of the most important arguments in Tempestad en los Andes is that there is a division between Cusco and Lima. Following the assassination of the Inca Atahualpa, the conquistador Francisco Pizarro traveled around the north of Tawantinsuyo, or the Inca Empire, and would found the new coastal capital of Lima in 1535. Even after independence, Peru centralized power in Lima, where industry and politics would be siphoned from the provincias to Lima. This has led to theories of a Peruvian internal colonialism, where inside Peru, a white Lima en la costa has a colonial relationship towards the indigenous and mestizo provinces in La Sierra. The book that influenced Valcarcel in this matter was Federico Mohr's Lima contra Chile, Peru y Bolivia. Alongside excoriating Lima's highly disproportionate power, Mohr glorified the Andean Mountains as the true seat of Peruvian nationhood and culture. He would even go on to say, "Ser peruano es sinónimo de ser antilimeño. Ser limeño es antítesis de ser americano. Federico Moro. Valcarcel would then claim Cusco to be the true embodiment of the Andes because of its history as the former Incan capital in the mountains. This division was done in binary terms, where Cusco is categorized as the indigenous, the historical, and the masculine, and Lima is the colonial, the foreign, and the feminine. One of the problems of Tempestad en los Andes is its uncritical stance towards connecting geography with machismo. The dominance of the masculine over the feminine is itself a colonial imposition from Spain, since the Incas have a gender system based on reciprocity rather than one of domination. While the masculine-feminine binary is wrong, Lima's image of itself as European and colonial is true. Lima's creation on the coast was strategic, since it allowed greater access to international trade and cultural imports from Spain, and, during indigenous uprisings, Lima has always been the refuge for the white elite in the provinces to escape to. In contrast, Cusco has a unique identity as the old Inca capital, and has high repute with the native Quechua and even the white mestizo elite, who often assimilate themselves to indigenous Cusqueño culture. Another main theme is the creation of new Andean myths to impel an indigenous-led decolonization, moving power away from both Lima and the white corporate elite. Decolonization, very simplistically, is the native people taking back control of the land and the political power of their colonized countries so as to dismantle the political, economic, and social institutions established by the colonizing power. As is the case, the Quechua and Aymara aren't Westerners. They have their own distinct forms of reasoning that are based on myths and collective memory, and many don't even speak Spanish as a first language. As such, Valcarcel ardently rejected most European political ideas as incapable of speaking to indigenous peoples. One of the ideas he did accept, however, was Marxism. Valcarcel would be influenced by the Amauta José Carlos Mariátegui, the philosopher who brought Marxism to Peru, and said that Peruvian Marxism had to look back to the Incas rather than to the Soviet Union as a historical model of communism that could speak to the Quechua. In the 1920s, Peru's economy was a mix between growing capitalist industries in the cities and the established feudalism in the countryside, known as gamonalismo. Under gamonalismo, indigenous peasants lived as serfs to the gamonales, who were authoritarian landlords who would own entire villages. What both Valcarcel and Mariátegui agreed on was that the working class is deeply racialized, with an indigenous peasant class who had its land stolen by a white and mestizo landholding class. Many of the gamonales had titles since the beginning of Spanish colonialism, and others gained them after independence. And what both of them agreed on still was that Peru could not be a true nation unless gamonalismo was abolished, and the land went back to the indigenous peoples. In the chapter El Problema Indígena, Valcarcel reprints his Arequipa speech, where he expressed his prophetic hope in the new Indian of the 1920s, living in a Peru that was industrializing and globalizing. The symbol of the new Indian also included a messiah figure who would lead the Indian masses like an Andean Spartacus. Influenced by Marxism, the indigenous masses for Valcarcel became the Andean proletariat, and this indigenous proletariat sought its Lenin. This didn't mean he wanted Lenin or any other European leader to swoop in and liberate Peru. Rather, the Indian proletariat would give birth to its own leader from the indigenous countryside, give up social vices such as alcoholism and submissiveness, and abolish the gamonales and have an indigenous-led government. Valcarcel gave a prophecy of this clash between the indigenous and neo-colonial elite in a section titled El Sol de Sangre, where he talks of a time in the Andes where so much blood would be spilled, the sun itself would be tainted red and purple. This is the myth of Yawar Inti, or the Blood Sun. This decolonization would be an apocalyptic war between the indigenous masses against the colonizers, and it preceded the ideas of Frantz Fanon by 34 years. In the middle are the mestizos, or people of mixed indigenous and white ancestry, who believe that they are no longer indigenous and side with the white elite. At one point, Valcarcel appeals to them by saying, Volver a la razón, hombres de los dos mundos, tú, hombre blanco, mestizo indefinible, contagiado de la soberbia europea, tu presunción de civilizado te pierde, no confíes en las bocas inánimes de tus cañones y de tus fusiles de acero. No te enorgullezcas de tu maquinaria que puede fallar. But when will this extreme violence occur? It has been argued, as some writers have, that the prolonged violence had already arrived with the internal war between the Shining Path and the Peruvian military from 1980 to the year 2000. In that 20-year civil war, a Maoist insurgency revolted in the department of Ayacucho, declaring only armed struggle could liberate Peru's poor. Their main areas of support came from Ayacucho, Apurímac, and Huancavelica, all composed of indigenous peoples and poor mestizos, whose support they gained by publicly executing corrupt local politicians and landlords in the Andean countryside. However, as the war moved on, the Shining Path had developed a cult of violence against the majority non-senderista indigenous population. Some of the worst instances resulted in the 1983 Lucanamarca massacre, where 63 Quechuas were ruthlessly killed, and in the 1993 massacre, 72 Ashaninkas and Nomatsigengas were killed across 8 communities in La Valle de Siriari. The Peruvian army is nowhere near blameless either, committing massacres such as that of Acomarca, where 69 Quechuas were tortured and murdered, literally erasing a whole village off the map of Ayacucho. According to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report following the war, almost 70,000 Peruvians had died, the majority of which were indigenous peasants. What was obvious was that both the Peruvian army and Sendero Luminoso had instituted colonial tactics against indigenous peoples, while each claiming to represent their best interests, raising a son of blood that continued 500 years of ongoing conquest. Despite such dark prophecies, Valcarcel is described as an optimist, seeing the return of indigenous Andean culture as inevitable, and it bringing a golden age as the Inca civilization had once done. In his chapter Ideario, he synthesizes his radical indigenista ideology, opening up with the phrase, "De los Andes irradirá otra vez la cultura." The whole chapter is a list of proverbs and aphorisms based on the Andean worldview and his own philosophical study. On one hand, he glorifies the landscape for its power, beauty, and divinity, recognizing the sun, the earth, and the mountains as beings that the Quechuas show genuine love towards. Likewise, he sees the introduction of European technology as part of indigenous life. During the Incan period, the indigenous peoples had many technological feats, such as their many stone aqueducts or the stone fortress of Sacsayhuaman. And during the Republican period, they built the bridges, railroads, and worked the machinery of their mines and factories alike. Though Valcarcel calls for the return to an agrarian Peru, he isn't demanding the end of the car or the light bulb. What he says is, "Podemos vivir en abundancia y bienestar. No nos torturaban abismantes inquietudes. La tierra excede, prolífica y maternal, a nuestras necesidades presentes y futuras." The ultimate purpose of Ideario is to show how his indigenismo places hope in an indigenous Peru as a true expression of Peruvian culture against that of the neo-colonial elites. That is why Valcarcel declares Peru to be Indian, indigenous, Inca, Quechua Aymara. It isn't a far-off declaration, however. People still have names like Flores and Espejo, which are just translations of the Quechua words Tica and Quespi, or they have names like Condori, Mamani, and Choquehuanca. Places also have indigenous names, such as Apurímac, Canchis, or Colquemarca, that come from both Quechua and Aymara alike, and there are at least 8 million speakers of Quechua, with the majority of them still in Peru, and yet this isn't even accounting for food. In these ways, Peru never stopped being indigenous, it just has yet to recognize itself as such. Tempestad Los Andes has been the subject of sparse academic intrigue in Peru for almost 100 years, and it is still widely forgotten in Peruvian memory. And it has not yet been translated into English for many Andeans in the diaspora. And this has been to the harm of understanding Quechua and Aymara history across the Western Hemisphere. Many other sociological predictions turned prophecies Valcarcel made would also come to pass later rather than sooner. The taking back of land and the abolishment of gamonalismo occurred with the Land Reform Act of 1969 under General Juan Velasco Alvarado, and only after the tireless efforts of indigenous unionization by Quechuas such as Saturnino Huilca. And the re-Indianization of Peru would occur slowly and peacefully, rather than as a violent army descending from the mountains upon the capital. Nonetheless, it seems that the Quechua and the Aymara Indians moving into the city would become Valcarcel's greatest hope for an Indian decolonization. In the prologue to the second edition of his book in 1972, Valcarcel claims that the last bastion of colonialism was taken. 1 million Indians had descended down the mountains and had taken the capital, without lightning, thunder, or arms. As the consciousness of indigenismo had arrived in the 1920s, so too did the people themselves arrive like a thief in the night would. The Cholos and their Indian parents had become the Tempest in the Andes, now arrived in Lima, now moving on the inside. And in the prologue for the book La Revolución India, Valcarcel had done what Mariátegui had done for him by writing his prologue 4 decades earlier, this time for a true Indian intellectual from Bolivia, Fausto Reinaga. Valcarcel had declared La Revolución India as a prophetic call to decolonization, with the rise of a new intelligentsia with Fausto Reinaga and the Indianization of Lima. Valcarcel said, "Los anti-indios se burlaron, pero ahora lloran inconsolables la indianización de su Arcadia. La Revolución India está en marcha." Prólogo, La Revolución India. In times like these, such prophecies are only true when the acts behind them make them so. And that is the myth, history, and future of the indigenista gospel of Peru, Tempestad en los Andes.